It is the scientific study of phenomena that suggests that we are able to know or be affected by phenomena that are temporally or spatially distant. That is, by events that we cannot perceive through the senses and that we could not guess the reason, and that occur more often than would be expected by chance. That is a mouthful, but what I'm talking about is what people may in their everyday lives experience, such as suddenly thinking about a friend they hadn't thought about for a number of years, and just that day receiving an email or a call from that friend. It is not certain that we know that this was not coincidence, but it somehow would seem to at least leave open the hypothesis that the intention of that friend to contact you might have affected in some way your own mind wandering. I would here actually take the words of one of the most famous and informed critics of parapsychology, Chris French, who wrote a paper that said parapsychology is not pseudoscience. And the reason why he said that is that he knows very well that in parapsychology we follow the same tenets, the same procedures that are used in mainstream science. And what makes science science is not what it studies, but how it studies it. Yes, well, the first answer is that when we say they look weird, one has to qualify that statement. One has to qualify it first with regard to who experiences that they are weird. Because even in our culture, there are a number of people who experience that these events are happening frequently. Not everyone by any means, but in surveys that have been done across a number of countries, people have found that majorities of people will say that they have had an experience like the one I mentioned to you, that suddenly they had a dream and the dream seemed to anticipate something that they could not have foreseen. Maybe somebody close dying or falling sick. So that happens even in this culture. But when we go to other cultures, actually, even though that may be not mainstream here, those events are completely mainstream. So if you get into a culture, the Yanomami that I know you mentioned at some point, or other Native American indigenous groups, you will find that the notion that you might be affected by something that is happening very far away in a mountain, very distant, or something that happened in the past or in the future may affect you now, are not considered to be unusual or supernatural. They are considered to be natural within the scheme of things. So within their world frame, this is completely natural. So one has to qualify first with regard to the notion that that is not supernatural for all cultures by any means. Second, that even for our culture, let's say technological cultures, that is not either supernatural for a number of people. Let me start with the history of the quote. As you correctly mentioned, it wasn't coined by Carl Sagan. It was actually coined by Marcello Truzzi, a sociologist who was very knowledgeable of the, let's say, parapsychological realm. He was a real skeptic in the sense that he had not a priori assumed that psi phenomena existed, but neither had he concluded that they did not exist. What he did, he's dead now, but what he did was to look at the evidence and then come to a conclusion based on it. Having said that, and the way that he used the phrase is very different than how critics use it. I remember it is in an article in the Zetetic Scholar, a journal he founded, and he used it in the sense that first you have to account for ordinary means to try to explain an event. Only when you have exhausted those ordinary means can you then propose, let's say, the psi hypothesis, that we are affected by things that are not bound by the senses or reason. And he said, after you have exhausted those, it is perfectly reasonable to propose the psi hypothesis. So it is actually opposite from how it is typically used. Now, to get more substantial, independently of the history of it, it is a problematic claim because, as you alluded, what is an extraordinary claim? Right now, you are pointing me through a camera, which would have been magical and impossible just a few centuries ago. It was a couple of centuries ago. People would have said, no, you cannot capture an image. You would have to be a magician. That does not occur. We are under a light bulb. Electricity would have considered impossible. So when we think of extraordinary claims, we also have to look at the history of science and realize that a lot of things that we take for granted in our everyday life were extraordinary in the past. So that is with regard to extraordinary claims. With regard to extraordinary proof, the notion is that, as you rightly pointed out, there has been a problem in that critics have ended up changing the goalpost. What I mean by that is that originally one could say that in the history of critics, they said, well, there are some people who propose weird things like telepathy, but there is no evidence for it. Then came the Society for Psychical Research and other researchers, and they did very thorough investigations, and I think they ended up showing that there was a very reasonable case to make that this occurred, that there was evidence for them. So now that there was evidence, then the notion was, well, yes, but this does not replicate, or it was not well done. So throughout the history of parapsychology, the researchers have ended up improving their method. Whenever there has been a reasonable criticism, they have improved it, so that you can say, well, I took into consideration your criticism, I have improved it, I do again an experiment, and lo and behold, I find that it again supports parapsychology. So then it went from there is no evidence to yes, there is evidence, but it does not replicate because there is not good methodology, to yes, there is good methodology, perhaps you have done statistics, but to quote another critic, Ray Hyman, it is like I cannot think of a plausible explanation for it. Nonetheless, I do not want to be convinced by it. And if you take that extreme of a position, or as two recent critics, Reber and Alcock, wrote, these phenomena are impossible, then there is nothing that you could do to try to convince those critics. I think what parapsychologists should much more reasonably try to do is to provide good evidence for the people for the vast majority of scientists who are not already convinced that this is impossible. And that is the vast majority. In surveys, in every single survey, and I have looked at them, majorities in every area have said that at least they are open to the possibility. They may not have been convinced, but they are open. And it's only a small minority that states, well, this cannot happen. And you would be a better person to answer that, being a physicist, but let me mention a couple of things. First, as has been pointed out by a number of physicists who are well known, who are well trained, well educated, and who also do parapsychology, there is no such thing as the law of physics. It is a theory and a set of observations that may have been very robust up until now, but that does not mean, and you can use Humean arguments, the philosopher David Hume, that does not mean that they will continue occurring in the future, tomorrow, or in another part of the universe. So laws is really a misnomer. You can say it's very well established findings or observations, but one then must say, but for which domain? And then you have to think, well, how much do the, let's say, very robust observations of physics apply to psychological matters or parapsychological matters? And now we're getting into very different domain. Really, I would say that physics does not only, or let's say mainstream physics, does not only perhaps not perfectly explain perhaps psychological phenomena, but it does not even explain everyday ordinary psychology. It's a different discipline with different aspects. There you have to take into consideration things such as emotions, history, personality traits. So you are, I would not say, confusing an apple for an orange, but an apple for a pasta. Very different aspect. Absolutely right. Maybe we should say extraordinary claims, as you said, require extraordinary funding if there is some basis for them, if there is some ground. And if so, it wasn't I, but somebody else, Saibo Scouten, published a paper a number of years ago, and he compared the funding for 100 years of psychical research / perhaps psychology, and found that it was about the equivalent of 2 months of funding of ordinary psychology. And I say, well, if we had only had psychology for 2 months, what would we know about psychology? So actually I say we know a lot more than we should, given that. There was a more recent study by Chris Rowe, and he found somewhat similar that in the Great Britain, which is probably the country that has the greatest amount of PhDs in parapsychology or related research, that the amount of funding for parapsychology all throughout the whole history was about the equivalent for, I think, a couple of years or something like that. So yes, we're not where we should, but we have only a few people overall who are marginalized, who are typically not in well-funded laboratories, who are doing what they can with speed and gum. I think the amount of acceptance of parapsychology has fluctuated across history. It has had its high and low moments. I do not think we are in a very low moment. I think actually there seems to be somewhat more acceptance because of all of the studies proposing, well, maybe we have a pantheist universe, maybe consciousness should be considered a fundamental aspect of reality. And when you open that can of consciousness, it is, I think, considerably easier to say, well, we do not know nearly enough about consciousness, so there may be some properties of it that do not follow the properties of what we call matter, and that may be amenable to be studied within parapsychology events. So where we go, in some ways, there was a recent paper by people I did not know, published in a mainstream journal. I have seen a bit higher rise, or a bit more people that are being interested in it, a bit greater acceptance. But whether we end up having, I think, much more knowledge about it will depend on whether we can have people like you, younger people who may be in academia and who are able to keep on studying without sacrificing their careers or their lives, and may be able to have students, and there comes to be a mass, a critical mass, shall we say, of researchers, because I think this is a matter of number of well-trained researchers within an area who should expand what we know. Because right now we have a few people, most of us are in psychology departments, we also do other types of psychology, but it would be just so good to have people who are in different aspects of biology and philosophy and physics and so on, who all come and contribute and expand what we have been doing so far.